You're listening to theoutdoorstation.co.uk.
Hello and welcome back to part one of a very special two-part podcast here at the Outdoor Station. 100 miles south of the French coast and 50 miles west of the Italian coast lies a rocky massif in the Mediterranean Sea, known as Corsica. Although its highest peaks only reach 8,858 feet, they hold snow for much of the year, and despite the Mediterranean location and the beautiful sandy beaches, the mountains are renowned for sudden and violent changes of weather. It is home to one of the finest and toughest high-level, long-distance Grande Randonnée walks, totalling 118 miles in length, and affectionately known by walkers around the world as the GR20. There are numerous books written about it. Probably the most well-known is published by Cicerone Press and written by Paddy Dillon. However, books are one thing, and a passionate storyteller is entirely another. Shirley Worrell is well known on various forums as P. Wiglet, and she undertook the GR20 in the summer of 2008. And with the walk being at the top of most UK and European hikers' to-do list, she's very kindly taken time to chat with me about her experience and all it entailed. So in this part one, I started off by asking her a very, very simple question. Did she enjoy it?
Well, I had an absolutely fantastic time. I suppose that my overwhelming feeling was, well, one of exhaustion. It took my knees literally months to recover from the sort of daily assault on the very steep downhills. But I was overwhelmed by the beauty of the place. I'd been wanting to go to Corsica for, I don't know, perhaps some 4 years or so. I'd heard things about it that made it clear to me that it was a very challenging walk in very mountainous terrain. But what I think I hadn't appreciated until I got there was just how staggeringly beautiful a place Corsica actually is. Absolutely gorgeous, fantastic views in every direction all the time, wonderful weather. One of the things that always attracts me to walking abroad is sunshine, and up in the mountains, one of the great advantages, of course, is the relative absence of biting insects, and so Corsica had all of those advantages.
The sort of amount of preparation work that you did for it then, did it take you a long time to gather the information and also the confidence to do it? I mean, you're a fairly experienced walker, so I would have thought it wouldn't have given you too much fear to approach it, but did it take time to build up that sort of dynamics to go?
Well, it's a sort of mixed experience in a sense. The actual time that I spent planning it, I confess, wasn't a lot of time at all, because I decided very much at the last moment to go. And in fact, I think having decided that I wanted to go, I set off something like 2 or 3 weeks later. And so therefore, in terms of time set aside to actually deal with the logistics of the thing, i.e. getting maps, reading books, trying to decide what stages I might do on a daily basis, I didn't spend a great deal of time doing that. But on the other hand, as I say, it's probably about 4 years since somebody first mentioned the GR20 to me, and I immediately realized that it was something I'd like to do. But I quickly learnt that, well, the thing about the GR20 is that it has a reputation for being quite a vertiginous sort of route. It's said to be a route that involves a great deal of scrambling, and I don't consider myself to be very good at heights. And so therefore, although I was keen to go, I always tried to be realistic, and I realized it was likely that I would probably go on my own. And so therefore, I have hesitated a little bit, because I didn't want to find that I was stuck up a mountain, basically, with no way of getting down. And another thing that scared me a little bit in advance of going was the knowledge that lightning can be quite a problem over in Corsica, as it can in the Pyrenees as well, but to a greater extent, I think, on Corsica. And during that 2 or 3 weeks that I spent reading up on the route before I went, I learnt that lightning strike is in fact the highest cause of death on the route. And so that's something that quite seriously gave me cause to wonder whether it was the right sort of place for me. And I contacted a couple of friends, one of whom has done it, another of whom hasn't done it, but but was a very experienced walker, and tossed the thing around in my mind, and eventually decided to stop, whittling about basically, and just get on with it. And now that I've been, of course, I'm delighted that I went. But yeah, I did think long and hard about it, because I know that it's quite a serious undertaking, really, the GR20. It's much more demanding physically than anything that I'd done before. And facilities for people to come and rescue you if you have an accident or make a boo-boo, I think are less readily available than they are in many of the other places that I've walked. And so therefore I did take it seriously, because it is a serious undertaking. And so although in the end I only spent 2 or 3 weeks actually dotting the I's and crossing the T's before I set off, I had been thinking it over for a couple of years before I went.
All right. And which book, or is there any particular book that actually struck you as being the most useful for getting sort of accurate information, things that were really important to you?
Well, the one that I liked the best was Paddy Dillon's book, which is GR20 Corsica, the high-level route. There's a couple of versions around, but I had what was then the most up-to-date version. I think it may still be. It's Cicerone, and it was published in April 2006. There's another book that a lot of people were carrying, and that's Corsica Trekking GR20 by David Abram, which is one of the Trailblazer guides. And that's more recently published. I think it was in January of 2008. And I like the Trailblazer guides because they always include a little summary of, they have little flower pictures, and as I've grown older, I've become very fond of spending time gazing at the flowers and taking photographs, and so I appreciate those. But I have to say that I did read each of them pretty carefully, and I found that Paddy's book was the one that contained the information that I felt I was more likely to want to have on a day-to-day basis. It also has a very useful, as well as having descriptions of the sections, it's got one of those useful little sort of profiles that shows you, how much up and how much down there is involved on a daily basis. And so that I actually took it with me. I don't normally take a guidebook, but we may come on to maps later, and if we do, then I'll tell you that I didn't. Unusually, I didn't take a map, but I did take the guidebook on this occasion, and it was Paddy's book that I took.
Brilliant. So really then, I suppose to conclude that this part of what you're saying is it's definitely a challenging walk, and it's walk for somebody who's experienced sort of long distance walk, should we say, not doing it as a first time long distance walk. Obviously it sounds like it would be a little bit more of a challenge and perhaps out of the reach of somebody who just decides to do this as their first long distance walk. And the other question is, I presume this, 3 weeks did it take you?
Now it takes, let me see, the standard is 15 days. I mean, you know how these things tend to be. It's sort of fallen into stages, and that's the way it tends to be walked. And so the standard is actually 15 days. I did it in 14 days, but that's only because despite the fact that I'd read each of the books more than once, I somehow managed to miscount, and I kind of thought that it was 14 days rather than 15. But it's a 15-day walk. Bob, just going back just very quickly to what you were saying immediately before that, in terms of how challenging it is, I'd want to just emphasize, I mean, obviously this is subjective, but from my point of view, I think that it's significantly more challenging than anything else that I've done. Definitely wouldn't suggest that anybody should even contemplate doing it as a first walk. And more than that, I would say that even people who are fairly experienced probably wouldn't enjoy it. I don't think you would enjoy it. I wouldn't have enjoyed it if I hadn't been fairly fit when I set off to do it, because the amount of up and down each day is really very considerable. And when you chuck in the need to either be confident enough not to be frightened of scrambles, or alternatively to expose yourself to a little bit of fear and be able to get through scrambles safely. When you include that in the mix as well, it seems to me to be stepping a little bit out of the ordinary in terms of the European walks that some of us go off and do now. I've done 2 or 3 summers on the high-level route in the Pyrenees, and I considered the GR20 to be significantly more challenging than that.
Before we sort of start talking about the actual route that you took and some of the key places and so on, obviously we can't mention everything, but I'll be fascinated to hear some of the stories you've got and associated with key places. The books and notes that I've read, obviously you want to take as sort of less gear as possible. Did you approach it from using all the huts as your accommodation, or did you sort of take a small tent or a bivy bag or something as a just in case, or did you mix and match both of them?
I took a tent with me. I thought quite carefully in advance about what I was going to do because one of the things that the guidebooks suggested to me before I went was that it would in fact be possible to use the huts as both a source of accommodation and also a source of an evening meal. And of course the point was made quite correctly that if you choose to do that, then you can carry considerably less weight because you don't have to have a tent with you. And even if you choose to take a tent or a bivvy, you don't have to be carrying cooking equipment. And so therefore, I put quite a lot of thought into that in advance. I decided in the end that I was going to take a tent. And in fact, in the event, I didn't sleep in the huts on any occasion. I slept in my tent on every night. What I didn't do was take cooking equipment. And with the benefit of hindsight, I consider that to have been a mistake of epic proportions. And I don't know if you would like me to sort of touch on that now or whether that's something you might like to.
Yeah, please do.
Okay. All right. Well, basically, I think, to be honest, the impression I've got is that the GR20 is one of those walks that's gaining rapidly in popularity. Having read through the guidebooks, it seems likely to me that 10 years or so ago, and perhaps even less than that, it was possible to go to the GR20 and to stay in the huts and to eat really well very inexpensively. The impression that I've got, basically, trying to make sense of what I've read in the guidebooks and reconcile it with what I met in the huts, which is quite different. The impression I've got is that things have moved pretty rapidly over the course of the last few years, and perhaps the local people have realized that, there's a source of income here that's greater than they initially imagined. And the consequence now is it's actually very expensive, it seems to me, to eat in the huts. I found, for instance, that I was being provided with something like a bowl of lentils or a bowl of pasta and then perhaps a piece of cake for, on average, 15 euros. And of course, the rate of exchange varies. But when I was there, which was in July 2008, that was approximately £12. And I felt that £12 for literally just a bowl of pasta or a bowl of lentils and a piece of cake was pretty steep. If I'd been full after eating the bowl of lentils or pasta and the piece of cake, then I mightn't have been quite so concerned about that, because I do understand, of course, that there are logistical difficulties in getting things up the mountains. And I understand that, the local people do have to make a living. But the thing is that there weren't actually even particularly generous portions, and this was a bit of a concern, really, because the walk really is quite demanding. And so obviously if you are going to be doing a lot of uphill and downhill during the day, in sort of pretty high, in heat, then you do need to be able to refuel at night. So I found that I felt that it was a significant mistake to have left my cooking equipment at home. What I decided in the end that I will do if I go back is this. I think the best compromise is most of the refuges do actually provide a cooking area, a sort of self-catering cooking area, where people can do their own cooking. As far as I could see, and I was only observing because, of course, I wasn't using this facility, most of them also provide cooking pots, although I do know for a fact that they don't all provide cooking pots. But I think the best compromise is probably, in order to cut down on weight and be able to do it without breaking the bank, plan to cook your own food in the refuges. It's possible to buy food, like, for instance, rice or pasta, cans of sardines and whatever else it is that people like to eat. You can buy that in the refuges in an uncooked state, and then you can cook it for yourself. And chatting with other people who were doing that seemed to be much less expensive. And I did notice, I think I was almost the only British person that I met while I was doing the walk. Almost everybody else was French or German or from some other part of Europe. And I noticed that I think literally without exception, all of the French people who were doing the walk were cooking in that way, or they were eating in that way. They were not paying for food in the refuges because they were considered it to be too expensive. So they were buying it on a daily basis, or perhaps carrying some staples and cooking it in the refuges. So that's what I would do if I were to go back again, and I hope that I will go back again. I will also definitely be taking my stove and a mug, because I found that it's really miserable not to be able to make a drink when you first wake up in the tent in the morning. You'd have thought that I'd have learnt this by now, but it seems it's always possible to make a new mistake. So anyhow, I'll definitely be taking it for that purpose, and for the odd occasion when perhaps I might be able to cook in the refuge. But eating in the refuges is expensive. I mean, breakfast, for instance, is when I was there, it was, I don't know, €7-8, something like that, which is about £5. Well, it's not a fortune, but when you consider that it consists of, perhaps you choose between a cup of coffee or a cup of hot chocolate, and that sort of Melba toast that, you can get over there, and perhaps a little pot of jam. So it's pretty insubstantial. So for what it is, it's quite a lot of money. And when you multiply that by 14 or 15 stages, it's really quite a lot. Whereas, you could eat very substantially on something that you just bought and cooked up in the kitchen.
Okay, so just taking that point a bit further then, if you had have taken your own stove system and pot or whatever, what is the fuel of choice? What is what can you actually get hold of to cook with? Because that has to be the one biggest question that most people have when they go to anywhere else in mainland Europe is, what shall I cook with? Meths, a wood-burning stove or some form of gas, and is the gas going to be compatible?
Well, I'll come back to wood-burning stoves in a moment. Meths, I don't know, to be honest, because I didn't look. But when I the only time that I haven't taken a stove, sadly, is when I went to Corsica. So on every other occasion, I use some kind of gas. And when I've walked in the Pyrenees, I've used, the sort of blue bottles of, is it called camping gas or something like this, that they tend to have over here. And I found that it's possible to get a little converter that just screws onto the top of the camping gas bottles, and then I can use it with my British stove. I use a Primus Micron because it's very small and very light, but there are other similar things that work just as well. And so that's what I would do. I did see people using camping gas. So like I say, you can either use the stoves that are available in the kitchens, the sort of, just like an ordinary cooker, industrial things that are available for communal use in the kitchens. Or if you wanted to cook in your tent or make a drink in the morning in your tent, then you can use the camping gas and use a converter. I've no doubt that it might be possible to buy some kind of spirits as well, but I'm afraid I have no idea about that because I've never tried to do that over there. As for the wood-burning stoves, now see, I've never used a wood-burning stove, but I know that you are keen on them. I've spoken to Andy Howell about them. I know he's very keen on them. And I've watched a few videos on YouTube, and they do look pretty exciting. And it might be that a wood-burning stove would be an option. There are certainly lots of little bits and pieces of dead trees that have been struck by lightning. Wasn't paying close enough attention to notice whether it would be possible on the average day to gather enough wood to be able to cook by. But I wouldn't be surprised if it was. So you'd probably have to ask somebody who'd taken a proper look. But as a matter of principle, that might be a possibility.
Okay, and do you actually pass through enough villages to pick up some provisions and gas or whatever else, or are you totally reliant on whatever the huts can provide?
Well, you're almost completely reliant upon what the huts can provide. In terms of villages, really, you start out at a place called Calenzana, and then, hang on a sec, I have to remind myself. Then I think I'm right in saying you don't then actually get into a village as such until what's approximately the midway point, which is a place called Visavona, which is a very small village, but it feels like a thriving metropolis in comparison with what you've passed through before. But essentially the walk is broken into two halves, the northern part and the southern part. And I think most people probably walk it north to south, which is what I did, although, a significant minority of people go south to north. But I think that there are probably more people doing half of the route than there are doing the whole route at any one time. And so in either one of those halves, you're not going to be going through villages on a daily basis as you might do, if you were walking along the Pyrenees, or if you were walking in this country along something like the Pennine Way or the Coast to Coast or the West Highland Way. It isn't like that. It really is a mountain walk where you're just walking from refuge to refuge. And the refuges do have supplies of things that you can buy. As I say, you can buy staples. I didn't pay a great deal of attention because I wasn't buying them, but because I'm always hungry, I did notice that they were selling things like pasta and rice and cans of sardines and so on and so forth. And some refuges, of course, had supplies that were more extensive than those available at other refuges. So you can get that kind of thing, but I wouldn't like to rely upon the possibility of being able to get hold of camping gas at any particular stage. As I say, I didn't take the stove, and so therefore I didn't actually have to look into it in any detail. But before I go back, I will look more carefully and make some inquiries to try to find out where it might be possible to get the camping gas. Because if it isn't available at the refuges, then I suppose that it would be necessary to wait for Visavona. And to be perfectly honest, I'm not even absolutely sure that you would expect to get it there.
Okay, well, I think that's probably one of the most interesting sections, really, to do with this particular route, because it's something that's always plays on my mind, and I know on a lot of people's mind who've spoken to me and asked me about different places is the fuel and the cooking issues, and obviously then, as you quite rightly say, the balancing with the actual staple diet as well, because that food is the most heavy thing that we carry, of course. But let's actually move on to the walk itself. This is going really well. Obviously, you did it in 14 days. Congratulations.
Thank you.
I saw a bit of a talk from Paddy Dillon not so long back, and he was suggesting that when people first arrive, they spend sort of 24 hours acclimatising themselves to the fact that it is a warm Mediterranean part of the world. Did you do that? Where did you actually fly to, and did you sort of take time before you actually started it, as it were?
Okay, well, I suppose perhaps almost inevitably. No, I didn't actually take the advice to do the acclimatising, because I seem to have a habit of kind of deciding at the last moment to go off and do things. But no, what I did was, in the 2 or 3 weeks available to me to decide whether I was going, and if indeed I was, then how I was getting there, I did quite a lot of research on the internet into how I might get there, and I discovered that you can fly directly to Corsica from London, and I think probably also from Manchester. But it's relatively expensive to do that. Probably, I don't know, last year I think it was probably something like £450 return or something like that. And when I looked around, I found that it was possible to break it into 2 parts. And so what I did is I flew with EasyJet from Liverpool to Nice. And I think that I left Liverpool at about 7:15 in the morning and got to Nice at something like 10:30 in the morning. And then I spent I don't know, the late morning and early to mid-afternoon in Nice. And then I got a second flight, this time with Air France from Nice to Calvi, which is one of the airports on Corsica. And then at Calvi I did take Paddy Dillon's advice, which was to flag down a taxi and jump in and ask to be taken to the youth hostel, well, I'm not sure the youth hostel, the refuge, at Calenzano, which is the start point. So that's how I did it. And I found that was literally half as expensive. It cost me approximately £200 return for those flights. And the taxi to Calvi was approximately €30 in one direction. So from Calvi, to Calenzano cost approximately €30. So that's how I did it. And I arrived at, I'm just trying to think what time I actually got to Calenzano. I suppose that it was early evening, perhaps 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, something like that. And basically, I wandered over to reception, paid, I think it was €4 or something very inexpensive to put up my tent, and then just nipped up the road quickly. I'd been told by somebody there was a Spar shop up the road, and I managed to get there just in time to buy some sort of basic lunch supplies that I hope were going to carry me through the next few days. And then I wandered around the village, and found somewhere to have dinner. There were several restaurants, and I chose the one that looked good because I could eat outside, and I did, and then I went back to the tent and basically slept, and the following morning I set off. So, no, I suppose that I spent several hours in Nice, so in that way, I sort of had time to ease into the fact that I was, not working and I was now on holiday, but I didn't have a day to wander around and get used to the climate or anything like that.
But I suppose by the sound of it, you've managed to unwind in that wonderful way that when you do get away from Liverpool or wherever, that by the time you actually end up in a place like this, a glass of wine and a nice meal and a bit of sunshine as we watch the sun go down always does help the old temperament, doesn't it?
Oh, definitely. Mm.
So you set off the following day. Is it an early start to get going?
It is an early start. I'd heard in advance that many people start walking at what seemed to me to be crazy hours in the morning. I'd heard that some people will start out at 5 a.m. and quite commonly people will leave at 6 or 7. And I'm not very good at getting up early, and I'm pretty slow in the morning, so I was a little bit concerned about that. But I found that I soon slipped into the routine. Basically, people do tend to set off early in the morning. I found that as the walk went on, I was commonly leaving, setting off for the day's walk at something something like 7 a.m., something like that. So I suppose that means that I was waking at 6 or possibly, sometime between 5:30 and 6 a.m. and getting off at 7. And the main reason that people do that, of course, is that the heat builds up quite rapidly, during the course of the morning. And I mentioned lightning earlier on and the dangers of lightning strike. And although I'm certainly no expert on climate, I do understand that as the day goes on, you're more likely to encounter those storms. And so therefore it's a good idea to try to get the walk out of the way before the storm clouds gather and storms containing lightning begin to happen, in the mid-afternoon. So that's one of the two reasons that people tend to make an early start. The second reason that people tend to make an early start is that those people who want to stay in the refuges as opposed to camp outside, I've heard that they like to sort of nip off as quickly as possible to be sure that they can get a place for the following night. I don't know whether anybody encountered any difficulty getting a place while I was doing the walk, because, as I mentioned earlier, I wasn't actually sleeping in the refuges, but I certainly read I think probably in Paddy's book and possibly also in David Abrams' book, and definitely in accounts that I've read on the web, that later in the season it can become very busy in the refuges, and so people are basically racing each other rather, from one refuge to another to make sure of getting a place. For those who are camping, as I was, the only sort of advantage other than that involved in avoiding the lightning is of getting the pick of the camping spots, because I found when I got to the refuges, there are camping areas outside each of the refuges. The ground over there was very different from any ground that I'd ever camped on before. It's baked clay, essentially, and it's extremely hard. And what they tend to do is they tend to section off the ground into little sort of emplacements or emplacements or something like this, each one of these being, sufficient for one tent. And so it's not, as it might be over here, a big green field or a muddy field where you just sort of pick a spot and put the tent down. You look for these prearranged places. They might be marked off with rocks, for instance, or little bits of wood, nothing more formal than that, but it's very obvious when you look, this is where you're supposed to put the tent, and that's not where you're supposed to put the tent. And an advantage, of course, when you're camping of getting off early is you can have the pick of the places, the places where you might wish to put your tent. But I mean, essentially, the whole place is so beautiful that it doesn't really make an enormous difference. All the places are lovely, but it's always nice to have the pick of the bunch when it comes to choosing where to put the tent up.
Yeah. No. What's the actual legal situation as regards, wild camping if you got either caught short or if the campsite and the refuge was full? Presumably you've got to camp somewhere else. Is that possible?
Well, it's possible to put up the tent somewhere illegally, but it isn't allowed. It's a national park, and wild camping isn't allowed at all. I didn't actually see anybody doing it. Although I did on one day speak to a couple who were walking in the other direction. We met at some refuge or other and sat around chatting over a can of Corsica Cola, I think it was called. And they told me that they had in fact put up their tent. I can't remember whether it was the night before or whether it was a little bit earlier in the journey, but they did put up their tent one night in some particularly scenic spot rather than outside a refuge. And they said that the following day, when they arrived at the next refuge, the Guardian was onto this immediately and very suspicious and said to them, well, where did you stay last night? Because if you'd stayed at, the refuge before this, then you shouldn't be here by now because it takes longer than this to get here. And I can't remember what excuse they gave him, but definitely they needed to mollify him. So it isn't allowed. I don't know what consequences might follow if they definitely caught a person out while camping. But of course, the reality is that, if you were to have an accident or something, then it's always physically possible to put the tent up next to the path.
Right, well, coming back to the actual trip itself then, you're obviously following the days as marked out in Paddy's book, or which the book you took with you. How did the walk unwind, as it were? Do you sort of hit a steep climb to start off with, and there's a long pull, or does it gently build up to some serious climbs?
Well, you jump in pretty much at the deep end, basically. If you walk north to south, as most people do, and as I did, then you very much jump in at the deep end. I think I mentioned earlier on that a lot of people will be walking only either the north or the south part, and although they're both sides of the walk are demanding. I think everybody would agree that the north is the more demanding of the two routes. It's rockier and there's more up and down, and quite a lot of people would also say, I think, that perhaps the first day is the most challenging of all the days on the route. The first day goes from Calanzana to, and I won't even attempt to try to pronounce this because I just can't, but it's Refuge Dortu Diu Piobu or something like this. But anyhow, it's the standard stage for the first day. It's about 20 kilometres, and basically it's uphill all the way. There's absolutely no downhill at all, so it really is pretty exhausting, and it's hot as well. I went at the beginning of July, and I deliberately chose to go at the beginning of July because it seemed likely to be the first part of the season when I wasn't likely to encounter snow. I mean, you can still have snow in July. Then again, you might find that there's no snow in June, according to what I've read. But the beginning of July seemed to be the best compromise. And the worst of the lightning storms occur later in the season. And as I've mentioned a couple of times already, I was very keen to avoid them. So that's why I went at the beginning of July. But although it was early in the season, it was still hot. And so, yes, you jump in very much at the deep end with the first day, 20 kilometres, and it's just up all the way. After that, the pattern that most days seem to take is that there will be a very steep ascent, followed by an extremely steep descent. The ground underneath it's very rocky, and as I say, it does tend to be steep. I find that we're all different in the way in which we walk, but I don't tend, I'm immediately reaching for the table so that I can touch wood, to encounter too much difficulty going uphill. I find that uphill's not normally too much of a problem to me, but as my knees grow older, I find that I do encounter difficulties doing steep downhills, carrying weights, and my knees get really very painful. I never do any walking now without pacer poles, and so therefore I do have those to rely upon. But I found that even with the pacer poles, that some of the downhills were really very, very challenging and actually pretty miserable, basically. At times I'd sort of have to sit down and take a deep breath and have a little sip of my water. And, well, sadly I was smoking then. I've managed to chuck it in again since that time, but I'd sit down and have a cigarette and ponder on how much longer it was going to take me to get down to the refuge at the bottom of the hill. So, yes, each day tends to sort of fall very naturally into a very steep uphill, followed by a very steep downhill, more than any other kind of route that I've done so far.
So if you were starting around sort of 7ish each day, what sort of time were you arriving at your destination? About, 6, 7 again?
Oh, no, very early, really, because, not too long after lunch, in fact, because I suppose the advantage of starting early is, of course, that, you're going to finish pretty early as well. And it wasn't uncommon to finish the walk at something like 1 or 2 o'clock. I'm just glancing here at the list of distances that I made, and most of the days are not actually awfully long, and some of them are very short in terms of distance covered, although they still feel pretty challenging because the amount of up and downhill involved. But for instance, the first day, going by the stages that people normally walk, the first day is 20 kilometres, but the second day is only 8 kilometres, and the third day, this seems incredible to me, in fact, now that I'm looking at it, but the third day is only 6 kilometres, and then we go to 9, 15, 17, 10, 11, 13, 24, and so on. So day 2 and day 3 and 4 at 8, 6, and 9, they're very short in comparison with the other ones, but they still managed to feel pretty challenging because of the sort of ground that was being covered. And I suppose that it must have been the case that I see that day 3 it was the day that I finished at a place that's called Hort Asco, and I think that I did get there, 12 or 1 or something very early. But most days were probably finished at something like 2 o'clock.
Right, and I suppose, of course, as you arrive early at these refuges, they're the temptation is to spend money, isn't it, to occupy your time and also treat yourself?
Yeah, it is. And of course, I always like to treat myself to, well, I like to treat myself to a beer, essentially, is what I like to treat myself to first. And of course, it's not hugely expensive, but it's quite expensive in comparison with how it would be here. I mean, for instance, beer, again, in July of last year, a beer was generally about €5. You could get a Coke or another soft drink, that would be about €3.50. But it's still, what's that, like £4, almost £3 for a beer or for a Coke. And I noticed that a lot of the people who were doing the walk didn't treat themselves. They were really quite strict. As I say, there were a lot of people who were there from France or Germany who were cooking in the refuges, and they were clearly doing it on a tight budget. And I think you do need to be careful in order to be able to do this walk on a tight budget, because otherwise it can quite easily become an expensive walk.
Can I just interrupt you there? Yeah, I just suddenly thought, I mean, I am presuming, obviously, that these huts only took cash as well, didn't they?
Well, I think that must be so. I didn't attempt to pay at a hut with anything other than cash, and I'm sure that they will only take cash. I did pay with a card twice, but on both occasions they were at hotels. I mentioned that Visavona is a sort of village that's more or less in the middle, and I treated myself to a hotel there, and they took a card. I did try to get some cash out against my card the following morning. I hadn't run out, but, there's always the feeling that it might be nice to have a little bit extra as a reserve. So I thought I'd get some if I could. But it wasn't possible. I mean, it may be possible next year or the year after, but it wasn't possible last year. And at Conca, which is the end of the walk, I stayed in a hotel there, and they also allowed me to pay with a card. But otherwise, I think it would have to be cash. And also in relation to that, and this is a point that Paddy makes in his guidebook, and I'm really glad I noticed, you cannot get you can't get cash along the way because you're not walking through villages, and because, as I say, well, the hotel that I stayed at in Visavona didn't allow me to take money out. You can't get it along the way, and you definitely do need to take it with you. It's absolutely essential that you take it with you. So anybody who's planning to do it, you really do need to think very hard about how much money you're going to need and make sure that you've got it. And I would say err on the side of caution if you can. Take a little bit extra. You can always chuck it back in the bank when you get home, because you can't resupply en route as you can almost everywhere else.
Well, with that comment in mind, Cheryl, I mean, 2008, how much cash were you actually carrying with you, if you don't mind me asking?
No, I took €800 with me, and I was thinking, and so of course I'd already paid for the flights, but the €800 was for everything else, the taxis to and from Calvi, and the refuges, the food, and the beers, and whatever else I might come across. And that was enough, but having said that, because I did like to have a beer in the evening, and occasionally 2 beers, or maybe a beer and a hot chocolate or something like that, I mean, I can't say I came home with tons of cash. I can't actually remember now whether I brought anything back, but if I did, it won't have been a great deal. Now, I know it would have been possible to spend less than that if, as I say, I'd actually bought raw food, as it were, and cooked it in the refuges. But because I wasn't doing that, because I was sort of reliant upon eating in the refuges, I was spending, let's say, €15 for dinner. I mean, it all mounts up. Let's say €15 for dinner, add on 5 for a beer, so you're at 20. If you're going to have breakfast, that's another 8, let's say, so that's 28. And if you want a hot chocolate too, well, let's say that's, I don't know, let's say that's bringing it up to about €30. It's easy to spend €30 a night if you're eating in the refuges, and it would be pretty easy to spend more than that, but it's very easy to spend €30 a night, and when you multiply it by 15, you can see how it kind of mounts up.
Certainly soon adds up. And obviously you mentioned it, or you've implied it, that certainly the other Europeans, as it were, that were doing the trip, was the general conversation that it's getting very expensive to do? Did they feel the pinch?
Well, I think that is what people felt. I mean, I immediately have to sort of add the caveat that conversation was in French, and my French is not terribly sophisticated, but I do try, and certainly we did try to talk. And I think that the feeling was, that it's quite an expensive trip. And those people, the people that I chatted with, who there were a few people who were doing the whole thing, who started on the same day as me, and so inevitably you get to sort of recognise the familiar faces, and we'd sort of chat when we could, in the evenings when language allowed. And yes, unless I've misunderstood them, they did seem to feel that it was expensive, and they indicated that the reason that they were eating, cooking their own food, and camping in a tent as opposed to eating in the refuge and sleeping in the refuge is because they were trying to save money on it. My language skills were not sophisticated enough to learn whether they felt that it had become more expensive in recent years than it had been. I mean, I don't know about that, but that's definitely the impression I've got from having read, Paddy's book and looked in David's book and read what other people have said before. I think that it must have become significantly more expensive, in fairly recent years, basically.
And on that note, we draw part 1 of these podcasts to a close and hope you return to join us again for part 2, which will be available very soon. For more information about Shirley's GR20 trip and others she has made, do visit her website for photos, detailed information, and a lot of outdoor inspiration. Her website is www.pwiglet.com, and you spell that PEEWIGLET.com. So until next time, folks, safe travels, high peaks, happy hiking, and bye for now.
This independent programme is produced and hosted by theoutdoorstation.co.uk.